Hello and welcome to the Children's Safety Network webinar on bullying prevention, law, and policy. My name is Jenny Stern-Carasone and I am a staff member at the Children's Safety Network. I'm very pleased to have you all here joining us today. A brief overview of some of the technology for our webinar today to make your viewing and listening experience more pleasurable. All of our audio is broadcast through the computer speakers. If you experience any difficulties, please dial the phone number you see listed in the information in the upper left-hand corner and mute your computer speakers. Your phone line will be muted on our end. All questions are being received via the question and answer pod you see in the lower left-hand corner. This session is being recorded, and a recording link will be posted on the CSN website and shared with everyone. And you are welcome to download the resources you see in the file share pod in the upper right at any time. At this time, I want to introduce our two presenters who will be talking with us today about law and policy associated with bullying prevention. Jonathan Todres is a professor of law at Georgia State University College of Law. His research focuses on children's rights and child well-being, with a particular emphasis on vulnerable populations. Professor Todres' primary research areas include child trafficking and related forms of child exploitation, domestic implementation of children's rights law, and legal and cultural constructs of childhood. Professor Todres has published extensively on these and other children's rights issues. He also serves as a regular advisor to non-governmental organizations working to address violence against children, including as child rights advisor to the ECPAT USA, which is the End Child Prostitution and Trafficking USA group, and served on the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine Committee on Commercial Sexual Exploitation and Sex Trafficking of Minors in the United States. Professor Todres is a fellow of the American Bar Foundation and is also a co-author of Human Rights in Children's Literature, Imagination and Narrative Law, published by Oxford University Press in 2016. We will also be hearing today from Dr. Mark Hatzenbuehler. He is an associate professor of socio-medical sciences and the co-director of the Center for the Study of Social Inequalities and Health at Columbia University's Mailman School of Public Health. Dr. Hatzenbuehler's research examines how structural forms of stigma, including social policies, increase risk for adverse health outcomes among members of socially disadvantaged populations, with a particular focus on lesbian, gay, and bisexual individuals. Dr. Hatzenbuehler has published 90 peer-reviewed articles and book chapters, and his research has been published in several leading journals, including the American Journal of Public Health, Social Sciences and Medicine, Psychological Bulletin, and the JAMA Pediatrics. In recognition of this work, Dr. Hatzenbuehler received the 2015 Louise Kidder Early Career Award from the Society for the Psychological Study of Social Issues, also the 2016 Early Career Award for the Distinguished Contributions to Psychology in the Public Interest from the American Psychological Association, and the 2016 Janet Taylor Spence Award for the Transformational Early Career Contributions from the Association for Psychological Sciences. His work has been widely covered in the media, including interviews on NPR and MSNBC, and has been cited in numerous amicus curiae briefs for cases on status-based discrimination. We are pleased to have them both here today to present and share with us on this issue. I will hand it over now to Jonathan Todres.
Thank you very much, Jenny, and thank you to all of you for joining today. Mark and I are delighted to have the opportunity to present the findings of this National Academy study, and in particular to speak to the law and policy portion of the study. I want to take a moment just to acknowledge and thank the sponsors of this study that are listed on the slide you see before you, and they include the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, the National Institute of Child Health and Human Development, Health Resources and Service Administration, National Institute of Justice, the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, the Bagan Foundation, and Highmark Foundation. I mention them not only because we appreciate their support, because I think it also reflects the breadth of interest in this issue and support for research and action, effective action on this issue. We had a multidisciplinary study group. The committee's membership is listed on this slide. I won't read names, but I think it's important to note the breadth of fields represented: education, nursing, public health, law, medicine, violence prevention, psychiatry, and social media expertise. So we brought a lot of different fields together in analyzing this issue. We also had a really wonderful staff of the National Academies that supported the committee's work. Today, what I want to do is take a few minutes at the beginning to give you a sense of the study and the scope of the study, and then we'll turn and focus most of the time on the law and policy component. Each National Academies study is governed by a statement of task that shapes its focus. Our task was to examine the consequences of peer victimization, risk and protective factors for bullying, and current responses, including law and policy responses. We were particularly interested in several questions. First, what is known about the psychosocial and physiological consequences of bullying for both perpetrators and targets? How are individual and other characteristics playing in this arena? And we were guided by, and we used the socio-ecological model in our work on the committee, meaning we looked at individual, relationship, community, and society factors that influence both bullying and responses to bullying. And so as part of that, we also looked at what factors contribute to resilient outcomes among youth who are exposed to and engaged in peer victimization. One other note on terminology, we as a committee felt it was important to avoid labeling to the extent possible, so we stayed away from terms like victim or bullying, instead talking about and focusing on the behavior. So that's how you'll hear us talk about the study and the issue today. There are a range of definitions of bullying, both in law and also used by organizations and agencies. The committee for this study used the CDC definition of bullying, which was developed in 2011, and defines bullying as any unwanted aggressive behavior by another youth or a group of youth who are not siblings or current dating partners that involves an observed or perceived power imbalance and is repeated multiple times or is highly likely to be repeated. So the three key elements are the unwanted aggressive behavior, a power imbalance, either an actual or perceived power imbalance, and that it's either repeated or highly likely to be repeated. For today, what we want to focus on the law and policy component of this, and so we want to start talking briefly about why law should or can play a role in this arena. Then give you an overview of anti-bullying laws and policies at the federal and state level, and then I will turn it over to Mark, who will talk about the impact of laws to date and implementation. Before we get into the details of the presentation, one other note. We focused, in the committee did, on federal and state law and policy. We did not include local and school policies. There's one exception, one study that Mark will talk about, and I will also briefly talk about zero tolerance policies. But other than those two exceptions, we didn't cover local and school policies, and I think it's important to note why. First of all, there are very few systematic evaluations of local policies. There's also great diversity at the local level, and many schools have unique traits that make it hard to draw generalizable conclusions. So one of the reasons why we focus on federal and state in particular, is in many instances it's the state law that provides the mandate for localities and for schools to adopt measures and to adopt policies. And so we felt that was still informative. So our review looked at federal and state laws that refer to bullying, as as well as other laws and policies, most notably federal law, that use other terms such as harassment, but are understood as applying to bullying. So let me say a word about the role law can play. As you see on this slide, there's some other examples, and there are many more of the role that law has played in advancing public health. For example, motor vehicle safety and road safety. Performance and crash standards for motor vehicles are one way. The requirements for airbags, speed limits. There are many statutes and regulations that have helped improve road safety. Similarly, we could look at vaccination efforts, financial aid to state vaccination programs, as well as requirements that children be vaccinated to attend public schools, with some exceptions, of course. Tobacco is another area where the law has shown to help advance efforts to improve health by banning sale to minors, prohibiting advertising on radio and television, and so forth. So there are many examples, and that is why we focus as part of our study on the law and policy components. With that backdrop, it's not surprising then that we've seen, as attention to bullying has grown, that there's been a growth in responses at the state level. As you see on this slide, between 1999 and 2010, there were more than 120 bills enacted by state legislatures, anti-bullying laws and policies, and you see a growth over time as well. So today, all 50 states have anti-bullying laws. The great majority also have anti-bullying policies in place. Those are the states in blue on the slide. And the challenge now is evaluating the effectiveness and understanding the impact they've had and where there's still work to be done. So let me move to what the law, the current law, provides, and starting with the federal level. There is no specific federal anti-bullying law. Civil rights law and anti-discrimination laws can secure and do secure rights for protected classes. The protected classes under federal law include protection against discrimination on the basis of race, color, national origin, sex, disability, and religion. In addition, there's another law that's relevant in this context, particularly with bullying that affects children with disabilities. The Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, the IDEA, offers further protection for covered students. It requires, the IDEA requires that children with disabilities be provided a free, appropriate public education, and that education must be provided in the least restrictive environment and in conformity with an individualized education program, or IEP as it's known. Bullying may well interfere in many cases with a child's access to an appropriate public education, and therefore the IDEA may provide a remedy for children covered by the Act. Important to also note that there's some limitations to federal law in this context. First and most notably, federal law is limited to recognized protected classes. So if a child is bullied based on a characteristic that's not a protected trait under federal law, that child may not be able to avail himself or herself of a remedy under federal law. There's a second way in which federal law limits responses in this context. Federal law provides for individual rights, and school responses are constrained in that they must not encroach upon individual rights of children and adolescents. And the two areas that are implicated in particular include privacy rights of students and First Amendment freedom of speech rights. There's a second area of activity in addition to federal law where the federal government has a role to play and does play a role. The federal government can also offer and produce guidelines for the states as they contemplate responses to bullying. The Department of one notable one is the Department of Education's Office of Civil Rights produced recommended components for state and local laws and policies on bullying in what's referred to as a Dear Colleague letter. They have recommended that each state and local law and policy on bullying include 11 components. Mark will talk a little bit more about this in this sort of evaluation component. I'm not going to list all 11 components, but they include things such as specifying the prohibited conduct, enumerating the protected characteristics, training and prevention education, transparency and monitoring, and we'll talk more about that when we turn to the evaluation component. Turning now to state law. At the state level, as I noted earlier, all 50 states have anti-bullying laws. 49 include electronic forms of bullying or cyberbullying. There is great diversity among state responses to bullying and minimal evaluation to date. There are some key differences here. Definitions of bullying differ from state to state. For example, in some states, such as New Jersey, bullying can constitute, or a single incident can constitute bullying, whereas in other states it has to be an ongoing pattern, such as in Nebraska. There are also differences as to whether state laws enumerate protected traits. So Massachusetts has a lengthy list of protected characteristics, not just race, color, religion, but also socioeconomic status, homelessness, gender identity, physical appearance, and other traits, whereas some other states do not enumerate protected classes at all in their anti-bullying laws. And finally, there's also significant differences in the scope of jurisdiction. How much authority do schools have to respond? And what can they respond to? In some states, schools are limited to responding to that which occurs on school grounds and other locations such as school events or school buses, whereas other states, more than 20 states, have now granted schools broader authority to take action on anything that might affect the school environment for the child who is bullied. So that might, anything that substantially disrupts the learning environment, and that could include something that doesn't happen at a school event at all, particularly in the context of cyberbullying. We also see training differences, and one of the notable things across many states is that the mandate is unfunded or in many cases underfunded. I realize that's a very quick overview of state laws, and there's great differences among the states, so we're happy to answer questions at the end of the presentation. One other opportunity or potential area for remedies is litigation. And so we took a look at the litigation on bullying. Courts do offer a potential source of remedies, but that remedy is limited. First and importantly, most instances of bullying do not reach litigation. Typically, claims are only filed for the most severe cases of bullying, and the research shows that only a very small percentage of plaintiffs win their cases. Most cases favor the defendant, so that makes that quite a limited opportunity for plaintiffs. We want to touch briefly on zero tolerance policies, although they're not a federal or state policy. They have received significant attention. And by zero tolerance, we include policies that impose severe sanctions on students, typically suspension and expulsion for minor offenses in the hopes of preventing more serious ones. These policies became widely adopted in schools in the early 1990s, and they're applied in some schools still today in the bullying context. It is important to point out the research findings to date that zero tolerance policies have not made schools safer. They are not effective in curbing aggressive or bullying behavior. They can disrupt learning, and they're also disproportionately used to discipline students of color. So the committee recommended discontinuing zero tolerance policies. Let me take a moment to wrap up, and then I will this sort of law overview, and then I'll turn it over to Mark to talk about implementation and effectiveness. To summarize briefly, there are important protections under federal law, but federal law is limited. In particular, it is limited to those covered by the enumerated protected classes. For those not covered, it may present a much more limited remedy. States and localities have been very active, but there's a lot of differences across key issues and key components of bullying laws and policies. There's very little evidence and research to date on the consequences of expanding schools' authority, both in terms of whether it's effective in addressing bullying and what implication that has for the rights of children and adolescents. And finally, as I noted a moment ago, litigation does offer a potential remedy, but it is a very limited remedy, as most cases to date have favored defendants. With that overview, I'll turn it over to Mark, and then I'm happy to answer questions as he is at the end.
Great, thanks, Jonathan. So I'm going to switch gears a little bit here to spend the rest of the time talking about the research base on the effectiveness of anti-bullying policies and also on how they've been implemented. So despite the real proliferation of laws and policies that Jonathan discussed related to anti-bullying, there's really been a lack of empirical research on the effectiveness of these laws in reducing bullying. And instead, existing research on anti-bullying laws has really focused almost exclusively on content analyses of these laws. So this is a quotation here from a recent review paper that Cornell and Limber published last year in the American Psychologist that I think really underscores this point well. They stated that, quote, although the content of state anti-bullying laws has been evaluated and contrasted, remarkably little research has been conducted to study how these laws and policies are implemented and to what effect. So while this literature is still relatively in its early stages, there are a handful of published studies that have examined the effectiveness of state anti-bullying policies. And for the sake of time, I'm just going to quickly present two illustrative examples of this work. And if you're interested in other studies, we review those more in depth in our chapter. So these are data from a study conducted by Mears and Ramirez and her colleagues that studied the impact of Iowa's anti-bullying law, which was passed in 2007. That law required schools to adopt an anti-bullying policy that defines specific acts of bullying, to establish a process for reporting incidents, and also to describe consequences and actions for bully perpetrators. And to evaluate the effectiveness of that law, they used data from 6th, 8th, and 11th graders from Iowa who participated in the Iowa Youth Survey in 2005, 2008, and 2010. That survey is similar to the Youth Risk Behavior Surveillance System data set that is conducted by the CDC. And in that data set, the students were asked about their experiences of 4 different types of bullying in the last 30 days, including verbal, psychological, physical, and cyberbullying. So I've shown the results for this study here. On the y-axis is the probability of being bullied in the last 30 days, and the x-axis is time. So as I mentioned, students were assessed first in 2005, then the law was passed in 2007, and then students were again assessed in 2008 and 2010. So the odds of respondents reporting that they were bullied actually increased 1 year post the law, possibly due to improved reporting. But the odds of being bullied then decreased from 2008 to 2010, though not below pre-law levels. And this kind of similar delayed or gradual effects of laws has been observed in other types of public health law studies. So there's some mixed support for a policy effect in this study, but fortunately future data from the IOU survey will be released and can be used to continue to evaluate the effectiveness of that law. The second study that I wanted to talk about is a study that my colleagues and I did. This previous study in Iowa was a single state evaluation, but in the study that we did, we used a multi-state design from 25 different states. So what we did is we took information from the U.S. Department of Education report, which Jonathan mentioned. In 2011, they developed and disseminated a recommended framework for anti-bullying laws, and that report included a review of several different components in laws governing bullying in K through 12 education, and I'll talk about that just a little bit more in the next slide. And then what we did is we linked these data on state laws to data on bullying behaviors from the Youth Risk Behavior Survey from youth in 25 different states. So we had a sample size of nearly 60,000 students across these different states. Before I present those results, I just wanted to show the table that lists the different components from the Department of Education report that we examined in our analysis. This is what Jonathan showed earlier, so I won't go through each of these components. But as he mentioned, for instance, some of these components examine whether the state law defined the scope of the law and policy and whether it discussed responsibilities for reporting bullying incidents. So in terms of our results, we found that students who lived in states with at least one of these Department of Education legislative components in their law had a 24% reduced odds of reporting bullying and a 20% reduced odds of reporting cyberbullying. And in addition, we found 3 specific components of the legislation that seem to be consistently associated with decreased odds of exposure to bullying and cyberbullying. And I'll walk through each of those briefly. First, a statement of scope was included in the law that describes where the law applies and the circumstances under which the school has the authority to take action. So, for example, whether the law applies if students are off campus, but if the event is sponsored by the school. A second component of the legislation that was particularly associated with decreased odds of bullying was a description of prohibited behaviors that define the behaviors that are considered to be bullying. In some cases, differentiating bullying behavior from what may be developmentally appropriate peer interactions, and in other cases specifying that the behavior must be repeated to be a bullying behavior. And then finally, the state law included requirements for school districts to develop and implement local policies. And this dictates the components that must be included in local policies and may also set a timeline in which the local policy must be developed. So this study was the largest and most comprehensive study to date to document the effectiveness of anti-bullying policies in reducing students' risk of being bullied. So just want to mention a brief note about some of the strengths and limitations of the existing research on the effectiveness of anti-bullying policies. In terms of strengths, this work has begun to provide important initial insights into the efficacy of anti-bullying policies. And some of this work, such as this study by Ramirez and colleagues, has used strong methodological approaches, including quasi-experimental designs. and then other studies have used representative samples of youth so that we can create generalizable estimates. At the same time, the existing research also has a number of limitations. This work has largely relied on cross-sectional designs, which can only provide data on associations between laws and bullying behaviors. And in addition, these studies have not had information on how and whether these laws are actually implemented on the ground. And that's the topic that I'll turn to now in talking about moving from the effectiveness of these laws to how they're implemented. So there are a couple of different methodological approaches that researchers have used to study the implementation of anti-bullying policies. These include content reviews of school and district policies to determine compliance with anti-bullying laws. This research has also used quantitative surveys of teachers and administrators that ask them to report on their perceived barriers to being able to effectively implement these policies. And then finally, in-depth qualitative interviews that seek to understand factors that might either hinder or support policy implementation. Although this research is still in its relative infancy, there are some consistent findings that have begun to emerge from these studies. And I've listed those here. In particular, this research has uncovered some factors that appear to facilitate effective implementation of anti-bullying policies. These include general support from district and school personnel, strong school leadership, effective communication of the anti-bullying laws and policies, and finally, a sense of collaboration among school district and staff. This research has also identified a number of barriers to successful implementation of anti-bullying laws. Some of these include a lack of awareness of the specific components of the anti-bullying policies among school administrators and teachers. There's also been reports of confusion over the scope of anti-bullying laws and policies and the specific bullying behaviors that they cover. And this has been an issue that's been particularly pronounced with cyberbullying. And then finally, an ability of local jurisdictions to actually fulfill some of the mandates that are required by anti-bullying laws because many of these laws don't provide any resources in which to implement these policies. This list is by no means exhaustive, but it gives you a sense of some of the many challenges that there are to being able to effectively implement anti-bullying policies. A brief note about some of the strengths and limitations of this research on implementation. In terms of strengths, this work has begun to provide some valuable insights regarding some of the challenges that school administrators and teachers face in implementing these policies. And there's also been, one of the strengths of this work has been identifying some of the positive aspects of implementation that teachers and administrators have reported, such as bringing greater awareness and attention to the issue of bullying in schools. At the same time, there are some important methodological limitations of this work, including the fact that most of these studies have been conducted with convenient samples and therefore lack generalizability. And there's also been a lack of attention to rigorous research methods. And then finally, these studies have typically only evaluated a small range of the different components of implementation. So for example, they may focus on complying with the establishment of the policy, but not its fidelity, that is, how faithfully the law and policy is actually implemented on the ground. So that limits what inferences we're able to draw at this point. I want to spend a little bit of time before I talk about our recommendation from the report by briefly discussing some future directions for research on both effectiveness and implementation of anti-bullying policies. First, in terms of research on effectiveness studies, we need more research to determine whether anti-bullying laws and policies are effective in reducing bullying perpetration. At this point, most of the work has focused really on the targets of bullying rather than those who are perpetrated bullying. Secondly, we need more research to determine the mechanisms through which anti-bullying laws and policies actually reduce bullying behaviors. This information is helpful because it provides potential information on targets that can be identified and then targeted in preventive interventions. Third, we need more research to determine whether anti-bullying laws and policies impact all forms of bullying. At this point, only a handful of bullying outcomes have been examined. So for example, there's been no research on whether or not these laws and policies are effective in reducing a specific form of bullying called bias-based bullying. We also need research to determine whether the beneficial consequences of these laws and policies also extend to other forms of youth violence. So that is, do we see that these laws and policies may not only be effective in terms of reducing bullying, but also other forms of peer aggression and violence. We also need more research to determine whether among those who are bullied, anti-bullying laws and policies might actually be effective in reducing some of the negative consequences that are associated with bullying. And if we find evidence for this, it would suggest that laws and policies may not only serve a primary prevention strategy, but also a secondary prevention strategy among those who are bullied. And then finally, we need more research to determine whether these laws and policies are effective in reducing disparities in bullying. And that is, we know that there are some groups that are at disproportionate risk of being bullied, such as LGBT youth, youth who are overweight, and also individuals and youth with disabilities. But we don't know yet whether these laws and policies are effective in reducing some of those disparities in bullying. And there's even some reason to believe that they may not be effective because these laws typically don't address factors that place these youth at greater risk, such as stigma and bias and discrimination. So that remains an important area for future research. In terms of future research directions, for research on implementation studies, we need more research to fully understand all the different factors, including institutional, contextual, and social factors that either impede or facilitate the implementation of anti-bullying laws and policies. And this research needs to be better grounded in social science theory about behavior change and conducted with larger and more representative samples, and also conducted with state-of-the-science research methods. And hopefully this additional research will give us more information to make the implementation of anti-bullying laws even more effective than they currently are. All right, so I'll end here with, we had one recommendation in our report that focused specifically on anti-bullying laws and policies. And we recommended that the U.S. Department of Education's Office of Civil Rights, the state attorneys general, and local education agencies together should first partner with researchers to collect data on an ongoing basis on both the efficacy and implementation of anti-bullying laws and policies. Secondly, should convene an annual meeting in which collaborations between social scientists, legislative members, and practitioners who are responsible for creating, implementing, enforcing, and evaluating anti-bullying laws and policies can be more effectively facilitated, and in which research on anti-bullying laws and policies can be reviewed. And then finally, these agencies should report research findings on an annual basis to both Congress and the state legislatures. And the goal of this recommendation is really to strengthen existing anti-bullying laws and policies and ensure that whenever possible they're informed by evidence-based research. And finally, for those of you who are interested in learning more, we recommend and provide a link here for our report for those of you who are interested in reading it in full. And then also for those of you interested in spreading the word on social media, we've provided some information here on how to do that. So I think that's all that Jonathan and I have, and now I guess we can open it up for any questions that you might have. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Mark and Jonathan. We've had quite a few questions that have come in. Just referring back to Jonathan's initial presentation on the legal and policy aspects, You mentioned, Jonathan, about you're basing a lot of your presentation on the CDC definition, and we had a question about with the CDC definition, how is it defined or determined about whether or not the evidence really indicates the highly likelihood of being repeated?
So that's a good question. I want to be clear. Sort of that was the sort of framework we used in terms of using the CDC definition in terms of thinking about the issue. I think there's less certainty around what determinations as to whether something's likely to or highly likely to be repeated. So I think that's a really critical question. I'm not sure we have a lot of information at this stage to sort of be able to clearly say something's likely to be repeated. Mark, maybe you want to add something to that?
No, I think that's my sense too.
And also, does the definition of bullying cover anything having to do with hazing or sexual harassment?
So I think the critical question, of course, is which definition. If you're talking about, as a general matter, I should say, as a general matter, sexual harassment would meet the definition of bullying in a number of instances, right? And the same with hazing. If you talk about the key elements being unwanted aggressive behavior, second, actual or perceived power imbalance, and third, that it's either repeated or highly likely to be repeated. There are many instances in which hazing and sexual harassment would be captured by those key elements of the definition. It is important to note that state and local and school definitions may well differ from the CDC definition. So as to specific cases, they're obviously fact-specific, and then it depends on the definition actually used by that particular jurisdiction or that school or school district.
That's right. And there's a lot of variation and heterogeneity across states in terms of what behaviors are specifically included within the anti-bullying laws and policies.
Great. It sounds like there's just a lot of variability to contend with across the differences between federal, state, and then down to the district and local levels. There are also several questions just in regards to the litigation opportunities and utilizing that as a leveraging arm. One question came in regarding, looking at using the law as a means to address bullying, and if states have laws against bullying, why aren't people being charged with bullying like the way that we see people being charged with assault and battery, for example, when it's breaking a law?
Well, I think there are a couple of distinctions to be made. First, the anti-bullying law, most state anti-bullying laws really create a framework for the state, local jurisdictions, school districts, and schools to take action. They're not criminal laws as understood in the law. So you typically wouldn't find an anti-bullying law provides any means of charging somebody with a crime of harassment. Those laws already exist, and so it's possible to take that step. I think the research, raises questions as to whether that's an appropriate step. We know from the research on zero tolerance policies that those have not proven effective. It is important also to note that many children and adolescents who bully they are also themselves targets of bullying. They're both a target and perpetrator at different times. And so it is complex in many situations, and to simply say that we would sort of ramp up and charge these individuals with assault and battery, I think there are questions to be asked. Although I recognize that the trauma suffered by those who are targeted is very significant and in many ways parallels that suffered by somebody who is assaulted in a sort of criminal context, if you will.
Great. There were also quite a few questions, kind of moving more towards looking at this from the school perspective, since, there is so often bullying associated with the school environment. Some of the questions were in regards to, what are the most effective ways to address when teachers are non-responsive, when there's a policy in place but a lack of responsivity from teachers. What are some of the effective means that can be taken in that situation?
I think that's a great question and a really tough one, and I don't know that we have a lot of evidence at this point. That sort of gets into the implementation question of, there might be a law on the books that is relatively effective, but it's only so good, it's only so as effective as it can be if it's actually being implemented, and there can be a lot of barriers to that. Sometimes it's lack of awareness among teachers, but sometimes it's actually resistance for a variety of reasons. So I think that those are some good practice-related questions about what can be done if it's a question of awareness, then that suggests one tactic. If it's resistance, then it's another. I think that there is less research on the resistance end and more on the awareness end, where researchers and practitioners are now trying to do more to increase awareness of what the laws actually are, because there is a lot of confusion about at least some components of these laws in terms of what are teachers' actual responsibilities for reporting or communicating or monitoring, for instance. And a lot of times, as I mentioned, some of the barriers are that there's not a lot of resources that are provided in the law for training, for instance. So that creates a lot of difficulties for schools in terms of making sure that they're able to fully educate teachers on what the actual law and policy is and what the requirements are for their teachers. So I think there's been more work trying to address some of those barriers around awareness of the law. I'm not aware of much on this side of what to do when there's more resistance from teachers.
Yeah, the only thing I would add to that is there's a third installment to this series that will talk about preventive interventions, and that, I believe it's September 14th. Jenny, you can correct me if I'm wrong. That may well provide more detail about specific interventions at the school level.
Great. Along those same lines, you discussed the zero tolerance policy, which was so popular for a while and has backfired on so many different levels. So recognizing the ineffectiveness of zero tolerance, what initiatives have been taken that you're aware of to reconsider educational policy structures in regards to bullying?
Well, I think there's growing awareness of the need for training, and that's we focus in the committee did on training, and that's part of our recommendations as well, that any professional or volunteer who works with children should be trained on bullying. So there's, I think there's increasing awareness that this is critical. I think one challenge, and both Mark and I have sort of alluded to this, is that in many instances it's not been a funded mandate, and so that puts additional strain on schools and localities to provide that training as part of through existing resources. But training's a big piece. I think there are open questions about how to most effectively engage adolescents themselves in developing responses to bullying. and the evidence on peer-led interventions is somewhat mixed, but that's an opportunity for both more work and further evaluation.
So by peer-led, are you referencing the use of restorative justice as an intervention modality?
So restorative justice approaches could be part of it as well. By peer-led, I simply meant that many of the interventions to date have been designed and implemented by adults and applied to children and to students. There is sort of more limited subset of programs that have engaged students early and had them participate in designing responses to bullying. And again, as I said, there's sort of more research to be done on the effectiveness of those. But it strikes me, and I think there's opportunities there potentially to engage youth in meaningful ways to develop more effective policies and policies and responses that they would embrace.
And there is a section in the report on the small number of studies that have been done on these peer-led interventions, and I think that is another topic that will be discussed at that third installment in September.
Great. You both also discussed, the protected classes. Can you share a little bit more about what the research is showing in terms of the impacts on like students with disabilities and so forth, and more effective ways to address bullying that's occurring with those groups?
So this was an area in the report that we point out that there's we know from many studies now which groups tend to be at disproportionate risk of being bullied, and those include youth with disabilities, LGBT youth, and youth who are overweight. And there are particular forms of bullying that are related to bias and stigma and discrimination. That tends to be one factor that unites a lot of the groups that are at disproportionate risk. But one of the things that we talk about, so on the one hand, we know from the more epidemiologic literature that these groups are at risk and have a little bit of an understanding of why that is. But as we mentioned in the report, the literature on stigma and the literature on bullying haven't really, they've kind of existed on parallel tracks and haven't really, there needs to be more overlap and more attention to the literature on stigma within the bullying field. And that, again, in the next talk in September, they'll talk about one of our recommendations that there needs to be more interventions that specifically focus on these youth who are at greatest risk. Most of the school-based interventions now are universal prevention strategies that really target the whole school, and there's very little, if any, data right now on the extent to which those kind of broad school-level interventions are effective, if at all, in terms of reducing some of those disparities. And there's some literature to suggest that interventions that are effective at a population level can still nevertheless simultaneously actually even exacerbate disparities. It's called the prevention paradox. So we definitely point out in the report that there's more research that needs to be done specifically with these at-risk groups, and that looking to the stigma literature in particular will provide hopefully some helpful insights into how to begin to develop and then test some of those interventions.
Great, and I'm sure that we'll get much deeper into many of those school-wide versus population type interventions. I know there have been quite a few questions and comments regarding social-emotional approaches to bullying, and some of the really well-known models such as Alveus and so forth.
Right.
And
So stay tuned for the
we'll get into
September
that.
webinar. Yeah, they'll definitely get into all of those approaches and where the data stands with that currently, and how that plays out among different at-risk groups.
There was a really neat question, again, about trying to, integrate this law and policy perspective within the school environment. Do either of you have any suggestions on how to better, educate the masses, both at the student population level and at the teacher and even at the parent level, in regards to the laws and policies and how they're effective and how people can use them, such as like a law day event or some other kind of activity that's associated with the school that could achieve this?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think the first thing that comes to mind is that I think we're still not in a place in terms of where some of the limitations of the literature are that I outlined in the report, where we felt like we're beginning to start to address some of these questions, but there's a lot of research that still needs to be done before we can even get to the point where we can say concretely which specific components and which combination are the most effective in these laws and policies. So that's one of the reasons for our recommendation of a more systematic and comprehensive way to really monitor these policies, but also to be studying their effectiveness before I think we can even get to a point where we can say definitively what the most evidence-based recommendations are. But that said, I think in the interim, it is important to provide more kind of education through public service announcements, or some of the suggestions that the questioner said I think are great, just in terms of disseminating what is out there currently, and because a lot of people aren't aware that there are laws and policies in place, and what the specific areas are within those laws and policies that might provide some leverage for teachers and parents, certainly in terms of communication of the law, but also in terms of what resources exist for those who are being bullied.
Great. And, still along the school lines and so forth, are there any experiences or information that either of you could share in regards to effective ways of utilizing other partners to help enhance bullying prevention? Or any particular partners that can be effective? And I guess I would take that question outside of just the school. I think there is so much focus on the school environment, but obviously bullying occurs in many different environments. So are there particularly effective partners that would be good to go to?
Yeah, one of the things that we talk about as our recommendation in the report is trying to engage social media more, given the prevalence of cyberbullying, the impact of cyberbullying, and the role of social media in the lives of youth today. That seems like a very obvious partner that where there's a lot of work still to be done in sort of engaging that whole sector in terms of both monitoring cyberbullying, but also thinking about more effective ways of reducing cyberbullying. So that is one thing in the report that we talk about in particular, in terms of thinking about other social actors that are clearly relevant to bullying, but where we haven't done as much work as the committee felt that we could be doing.
Jenny, your point about going beyond schools is important also because there are a number of school-age children who are not in school who are targets of and engaged in bullying, and so it's important to address that population as well. Mark sort of captured what I was going to say about social media, but I would also mention families. Parents and families need to be engaged, and I think we see a range of practices, some more effective than others, in terms of successfully engaging families and ensuring that parents are partnering with and have the tools to help identify bullying when it's occurring.
That's great. And hopefully, again, that'll be another facet of what we'll delve into in looking at effective interventions to hopefully explore how to better include and engage families in that process. We are at the top of the hour. I have so many more questions both in my own head and that I've collected. I want to thank everyone for their participation and contributing your questions. Please do be aware that the next webinar in this series is on Wednesday, September 14th, and we encourage you to register and to attend, where we'll be looking more in depth at bullying prevention and intervention methodologies. I again want to thank our presenters today. Both Mark and Jonathan, your presentations were extraordinary, and I appreciate your time and effort in attending to all of these questions. Thank you, everyone, and have a fantastic day.